It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that begins quietly and carries no sign of what is to come. The sun hung high in the sky, its warmth softening the breeze that moved gently through the neighborhood. Birds sang in the distance, children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby park, and the streets buzzed with people going about their daily lives. For most, it was just another day. Among them was an elderly black lady who had lived in the community for many years. Her steps were steady but slow, her back slightly bent from age, yet her spirit remained strong. She carried 2 grocery bags, one in each hand, the kind filled with simple essentials: bread, milk, and a few fresh vegetables. The weight of the bags made her arms ache a little, but she didn't complain. She had carried heavier burdens in life than groceries. Neighbors who knew her often greeted her kindly. She was the kind of woman who always had a warm smile or a gentle word for anyone who stopped to talk. That day, too, she exchanged nods with familiar faces. To most, she was just Miss Evelyn, a sweet older woman with a calm presence. As she walked down the street, she admired the small details that others often ignored: the flowers blooming in someone's yard, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the way the clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Life had taught her to appreciate the little things, to find peace in quiet moments. Inside, however, she was not as frail as she seemed. Years of experience had made her wise, patient, and quietly strong. She had lived through struggles, seen injustice, and learned how to hold her head high no matter the circumstances. To anyone passing by, she might have looked like just another elderly woman carrying groceries. But there was far more to her story than met the eye. She paused for a moment to adjust her bags, resting them briefly on a low brick wall before continuing her walk. A few cars passed slowly down the street, their drivers lost in their own worlds. Children on bicycles zipped past, their laughter filling the air. Everything about the moment seemed ordinary, almost peaceful. And yet, beneath that calm surface, the stage was quietly being set for something extraordinary. As she continued, she thought about her family. Her son, especially, came to mind. Though she was proud of his achievements, she never bragged about him. To her, he was still the little boy she had raised with love and discipline. She knew the world saw him as someone powerful and important. But to her, he was simply her child. That bond, strong and unbreakable, was something she carried with her everywhere she went. She shifted her grip on the bags and straightened her shoulders. Despite her age, she refused to let others see weakness. She believed in carrying herself with dignity, no matter how small the task. Even walking home with groceries was done with quiet pride. At that moment, nothing about her suggested she was about to face trouble. Nothing hinted that within minutes, her patience and dignity would be tested in a way that would shock everyone around her. She was simply a grandmotherly figure walking down a quiet street on an ordinary day. The world around her moved on as usual. A bus rumbled past, people hurried into a cafe, and 2 teenagers sat on a bench sharing jokes. She passed by them unnoticed, just another figure in the flow of daily life. But life has a way of changing suddenly, without warning. The most ordinary moments can often lead to the most extraordinary stories. For Miss Evelyn, this day would prove to be one of those times. What began as a simple walk home from the grocery store would soon turn into a lesson the whole neighborhood and, eventually, the whole country would remember. But for now, she didn't know any of that. She only knew the feel of the sun on her skin, the sound of her footsteps against the pavement, and the quiet joy of returning home with her groceries. In her mind, it was just another day. What she didn't realize was that destiny was already moving toward her step by step, and the world was about to see her not as just an elderly woman, but as someone far stronger than anyone had imagined. Miss Evelyn adjusted the weight of her grocery bags once more as she walked slowly along the quiet street. The sun had dipped slightly lower, and the golden light stretched shadows across the pavement. She hummed softly to herself, an old gospel tune that had carried her through hard times before. To her, it was just another ordinary walk home. But life has a way of changing in an instant. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a police car pull up slowly along the curb. Its tires crunched against the gravel as it rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of her. She thought little of it at first. Police cars drove through the neighborhood all the time. But then, 2 officers stepped out, their eyes fixed on her. "Excuse me, ma'am." One of them called sharply, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. Miss Evelyn stopped, surprised. She shifted her grocery bags, trying to balance them, and turned her head toward the officers. "Yes, officer," she asked politely, her voice calm, though a hint of confusion lingered. The taller officer narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone not curious, but accusing. Miss Evelyn blinked, unsure of what he meant. "I'm walking home from the store," she said softly, lifting her grocery bags slightly to show him. The second officer, younger and more impatient, let out a small chuckle. "At your age, carrying all that? You sure that's the truth?" The words stung, but Miss Evelyn did not react. She had learned long ago that anger only gave bullies more power. Instead, she straightened her back and said, "Yes, young man. That's the truth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way." She stepped forward, but the taller officer blocked her path. His shadow loomed over her as he crossed his arms. "Not so fast," he said. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Can I see some ID?" Miss Evelyn's lips tightened. She knew the street well. This was her neighborhood. Suspicious activity that was nothing more than an excuse. Still, she reached slowly into her purse, her fingers brushing against her wallet. Her hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from the weight of humiliation. A few people on the sidewalk slowed their steps, watching curiously. 2 teenagers with backpacks stopped a few feet away, pulling out their phones. They had seen scenes like this before, an ordinary person suddenly surrounded by authority, forced to prove themselves without reason. As Miss Evelyn handed over her ID, the younger officer smirked. "Evelyn Carter," he read aloud, 81 years old, huh? He glanced at her bags. "Carrying groceries at that age? That's hard to believe." Miss Evelyn exhaled quietly. She wanted to remind him that she had lived through harder times. That carrying groceries was nothing compared to raising children alone or working long shifts just to put food on the table. But she stayed silent, holding her dignity close. The taller officer examined the ID as if searching for flaws. "What are you really doing here?" he pressed again. "This isn't your neighborhood, is it?" Miss Evelyn lifted her chin slightly. "It is my neighborhood," she said firmly. "I've lived here for 40 years. A ripple of whispers moved through the small crowd that had begun to gather. Some shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. It was clear to everyone watching that the officers weren't asking questions out of duty. They were harassing her. The younger one laughed again, louder this time, and said, "Lady, don't make this harder than it has to be. We can always take you in for questioning." Miss Evelyn felt her chest tighten, but she didn't let fear show. She stood quietly, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "For what crime, officer?" she asked softly. The crowd grew thicker, phones now recording openly. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering about the unfairness of it all. The teenagers exchanged shocked looks, their cameras catching every word. The taller officer leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound menacing. "Don't play smart with us. You better cooperate." Miss Evelyn's hands tightened on her grocery bags. Inside her heart, a storm began to stir, not of panic, but of resolve. These men had no idea who they were speaking to. They saw only a frail, elderly black woman. They saw weakness, but they could not see the strength she carried within, nor the power of the family she had raised. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "Officers," she said, her voice still calm, "you've had your fun. But now, I think it's time we end this." Her words carried a quiet warning, but the officers laughed, dismissing her. They had no idea that in just a few minutes, their arrogance would turn to fear, and their sneers would vanish from their faces, because Miss Evelyn was about to make a phone call that would change everything. The quiet street had transformed into a stage. What began as an ordinary walk home for Miss Evelyn was now a spectacle that drew more and more attention. The police officers, instead of diffusing the situation, seemed determined to make it worse. Their voices grew louder, their tones sharper, and their actions more aggressive. The taller officer still held her ID in his hand, flipping it back and forth as though her years of dignity and life experience were nothing more than a suspicious piece of paper. "81, huh?" he said, shaking his head. "That's a nice story. But something doesn't sit right with me." The younger officer, emboldened by the attention of the crowd, took a step closer to Miss Evelyn. He pointed at her grocery bags with a mocking smile. "What do you got in there, huh? Stolen goods? You really expect us to believe you just came from the store?" Miss Evelyn's lips pressed into a firm line. She glanced briefly at the bystanders, who were watching in disbelief. The two teenagers with phones kept recording, whispering things like, "This is messed up, and why are they doing this to her?" A man standing nearby muttered, "She's my neighbor. I see her all the time. They're harassing her for nothing." But the officers ignored the murmurs. Their focus remained on the elderly woman standing calmly before them. The younger one reached for her bag, tugging at it without asking permission. "Mind if I take a look?" he said, though it was clear he wasn't really asking Miss Evelyn's. Hand tightened around the handle of the bag. Her voice was firm, though still calm. "Yes, I do mind. These are my groceries. You have no reason to search them." The officer sneered. "Lady, we can do whatever we need to." He yanked harder, pulling the bag from her grasp. An apple rolled out and bounced along the sidewalk. The crowd gasped audibly. A woman from across the street shouted, "Leave her alone. She's not doing anything wrong." Others joined in, their voices growing louder. Still, the officers acted as though they were in complete control. The taller officer leaned in closer to Miss Evelyn, his face inches from hers. His voice dropped into a low, threatening tone. "Don't test us, ma'am. We can make this very unpleasant for you." The humiliation stung, but Miss Evelyn stood her ground. Her back remained straight, her chin lifted slightly. She refused to let them see fear in her eyes. She had lived through decades of struggle, through times when respect for people like her was denied again and again. This moment, painful as it was, would not break her, but the harassment escalated further. The younger officer, noticing the phone's recording, barked at the bystanders, "Stop filming. This is police business." His demand only made more people pull out their phones, determined to capture the injustice. The air was now filled with the sound of whispers, gasps, and the faint clicks of cameras. Miss Evelyn's voice cut through the noise, steady and composed. "You are embarrassing yourselves," she said softly. The taller officer's jaw clenched. "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "You're in enough trouble already." The arrogance in his tone rippled through the crowd, igniting anger. "Trouble? She's an old woman," someone shouted. Another voice echoed, "You're the ones causing trouble." The officers shifted uneasily, but their pride kept them from backing down. They doubled down instead. "We can bring you in," the younger one threatened. "You want to spend the night at the station? Is that what you want?" For a brief moment, Miss Evelyn closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the grocery bag missing from her hand, the stares of the crowd, the sting of disrespect. But beneath it all, she felt something stronger, quiet fire. The kind that had carried her through a lifetime of being underestimated. She opened her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but sharp as steel. "No," she said, "that is not what will happen. What will happen is that you will regret every word you've spoken here today." The officers laughed, dismissing her warning as the ramblings of an old woman. The younger one muttered, "Yeah, sure, you're really scaring us." But the crowd felt it. They could hear the weight in her tone, the authority in her calmness. She was not a woman lost in fear. She was a woman holding back power that the officers could not see. The harassment had reached its peak. Bags snatched, threats made, dignity mocked. The officers believed they had control of the moment, but they were wrong. Miss Evelyn slowly reached into her coat pocket, her fingers wrapping around the phone she had carried the whole time. She pulled it out with steady hands, ignoring the smirks on the officers' faces. "Now," she said softly, "it's my turn to make a call." And with that single motion, the balance of power in the street began to shift. The scene was tense. The officers still stood over her, puffed up with authority, convinced they had the situation under control. The crowd around them whispered, filmed, and shook their heads in disbelief. Groceries lay scattered on the pavement, a bruised apple, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk tilted dangerously close to spilling. But in the middle of this chaos, Miss Evelyn was calm. Her wrinkled hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she pulled her phone from her coat pocket. There was no panic in her movements, no fumbling or hesitation. She cradled the phone as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. The younger officer smirked when he saw it. "What's that, ma'am? You gonna call 911 on us?" mocked. His laughter was cruel and sharp, meant to make the crowd chuckle. But no one laughed. Not this time. Miss Evelyn didn't even look at him. She pressed the screen with steady fingers, dialing a number she knew by heart. The sound of the dialing tone seemed to hang in the air, stretching the silence tighter and tighter. The taller officer crossed his arms impatiently. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She's wasting her time." But Miss Evelyn's face told another story. Her expression was not fearful, not desperate, was composed, almost serene. She lifted the phone to her ear, her voice steady as she spoke. "Hello, son." The words alone made the younger officer snort with laughter. "Son, oh, this, I gotta hear." He turned toward the crowd as if inviting them to share the joke. But his smirk began to falter when her next words followed, sharp and clear. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm being harassed by a pair of police officers. Right here, on the corner of Maple and 5th. Can you send someone immediately?" There was a pause. The crowd leaned in, straining to hear. Miss Evelyn's tone softened slightly, carrying a warmth only a mother could give. "Thank you, dear. I knew I could count on you." The younger officer's grin returned. He leaned down toward her and sneered. "And who exactly is your son supposed to be, ma'am?" "Some neighborhood lawyer. A pastor." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Miss Evelyn lowered the phone from her ear just enough to look him directly in the eye. Her gaze was calm, but it carried weight, shades of strength, patience, and unspoken authority. Her words came slowly, like thunder rolling in the distance. "My son," she said, "is the Attorney General of the United States." The effect was immediate. The laughter died. The officers froze, their faces draining of color. For the first time since the confrontation began, it was not Miss Evelyn who looked small, it was them. The taller officer's hand, still holding her ID, began to tremble ever so slightly. He looked down at the card in his hand, then back at her face as if trying to convince himself it wasn't true. Attorney General. He stammered. The younger one's smirk collapsed completely. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, realizing too late that dozens of phones had captured his every mocking word. The whispers in the crowd turned to loud exclamations. "She said, Attorney General, did you hear that? Oh, they're done for." Miss Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She lifted the phone back to her ear, speaking softly again. "Yes, son, they're still here. I'll wait." The two officers exchanged panicked glances. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced with fear. Their posture changed, shoulders slumping, voices suddenly subdued. "Ma'am, there's no need to escalate this," the taller one stuttered, trying to backpedal. We're just doing our job." Miss Evelyn said nothing to them. She simply held her phone to her ear, her face calm, her demeanor unshaken. The shift in power was complete. The crowd, sensing it, grew bolder. A man shouted, "You were harassing her for no reason." Another added, "Now you're scared, huh?" The murmurs of disapproval had transformed into open outrage at the officers. Still, Miss Evelyn remained composed. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't rub her victory in their faces. Instead, she stood tall in her dignity, her presence, alone enough to silence the arrogance that had tormented her moments ago. Her calm response had turned the entire scene upside down. In the space of a single phone call, she had shifted from being treated as powerless to being revealed as the mother of one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. And she had done it all without raising her voice, without losing her composure, and without stepping outside of the quiet strength she had carried all her life. The officers, once puffed up with authority, now stood like scolded schoolboys, waiting nervously for what was about to come next. Miss Evelyn ended the call with a soft, "Thank you, son. I'll see you soon." She slid the phone back into her coat pocket, her movements as calm as they had been when she first pulled it out. And in that silence, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This was no ordinary woman. She was a mother. She was a survivor. And she was someone who carried power far beyond what anyone had guessed. The street was no longer ordinary. It buzzed with tension, every pair of eyes fixed on the elderly woman with the phone still warm in her hand. Miss Evelyn stood with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the very beginning, but now there was something different in the air power. Not the loud, showy power the officers had flaunted, but a deeper kind of strength that needed no shouting, no threats. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk gone completely. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "She's bluffing," he muttered under his breath. Though the tremble in his words betrayed his doubt, the taller one wasn't so sure. His fingers tightened around the ID he still held, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the cool breeze. He looked around nervously at the crowd, aware that every phone camera was capturing their downfall. And then it happened. Miss Evelyn's phone rang. The sharp tone cut through the silence, and the crowd gasped. The officers froze. Slowly, she pulled the phone back out of her coat pocket and answered with the same calm voice she had used all along. "Yes, son." Her tone softened with familiarity, but the authority behind her words carried across the street. "I told you they wouldn't. Let me go. They took my ID. They've embarrassed me in front of the whole neighborhood." She glanced briefly at the two officers, her gaze steady. "Yes, right here on Maple and Fifth." The younger officer's mouth opened slightly. His lips moved as if he wanted to protest, but no words came out. He could only listen as her calm report sealed their fate. The voice on the other end of the line wasn't loud enough for the crowd to hear, but the officers could sense its weight. Miss Evelyn nodded slowly as she listened. "Yes, I'll stay right here. Thank you, dear." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, her expression serene. But before she could even take a breath, the taller officers. Radio crackled. A sharp, urgent voice burst through the static. Unit 4, Unit 4. Report immediately. Who is with you on Maple and 5th? Stand by for direct orders. The officer's eyes widened. He fumbled with the radio, pressing the button with shaking fingers. This is Unit 4. We're dealing with a situation. Elderly female. He stopped abruptly when the voice cut him off. Stand by, the voice commanded. You will not move until further notice. The younger officer's face drained of color. He whispered, "What's going on?" The taller one didn't answer. He just stared at Miss Evelyn, who stood calmly as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The crowd buzzed louder now. She wasn't lying. Someone shouted. Another voice cried, "That's her son on the phone." The Attorney General. Phones rose higher, recording every second of the unfolding drama. Within minutes, another call came through the radio, this time from a higher authority. The officer's hands shook as he held the device to his ear, his face turning red. His words came out in fragments. "Yes, sir. No, sir. Understood, sir." He lowered the radio slowly, his eyes darting toward Miss Evelyn. The younger officer stammered, "What did they say?" The taller one swallowed hard. That was the chief. The Attorney General himself just called. He knows exactly what happened. The words hit like a lightning strike. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, their excitement feeding the moment. The officers looked smaller now, their authority crumbling with each passing second. Miss Evelyn bent down calmly to pick up her grocery bag, brushing off the apple that had rolled across the pavement. She placed it gently back into the sack, as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Her every move was deliberate, graceful, a reminder that she had never lost her dignity, not even. When they tried to strip it away, the taller officer cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, there's no need to involve your son any further. Maybe we can just..." Miss Evelyn looked up, her eyes steady. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you laid a hand on me," she said softly. Her voice wasn't raised, but the quiet power behind it silenced him instantly. The younger officer shuffled on his feet, mumbling, "We didn't mean anything by it." His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by desperation. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Someone shouted, "You mocked her." Another added, "You searched her groceries like she was a criminal." The tension in the air turned into righteous anger from the onlookers. Miss Evelyn, however, didn't feed the chaos. She lifted her head high, her voice calm as ever. "Gentlemen, I suggest you wait. You'll be hearing from him very soon." And with that, the balance of power shifted completely. No longer were the officers in control. They were now the ones trapped, waiting nervously for the full weight of justice to fall upon them all because they had underestimated a woman who carried quiet strength and a phone number that could change everything. Asterisk. The moment Miss Evelyn slipped her phone back into her pocket, the atmosphere on Maple and 5th changed completely. Only minutes earlier, the officers had been towering figures using their badges and authority to intimidate her. But now, their posture had shifted. Shoulders that were once squared in arrogance now slumped. Faces that had carried smirks now wore unease. The taller officer's radio crackled again. The commanding voice on the other end was sharper this time, carrying authority that cut through the air like a blade. "Unit 4, the voice barked. Stand down immediately. Do not engage further. A supervisor is en route." The officer fumbled to respond, his voice breaking slightly. "See, copy that." His hand trembled as he placed the radio back on his belt. The younger officer looked at him, panic in his eyes. "What do they mean?" "Supervisor is en route." Did the Attorney General actually? He stopped, realizing the answer was all ready. Clear dot. The crowd was no longer whispering. They spoke loudly now, emboldened by what they had witnessed. She wasn't lying. They messed with the wrong woman. Justice is coming. Just wait. Phones stayed raised, recording everything. The glow of the screens reflecting off tense faces. The officers could feel the weight of every lens on them. Each recording was proof of their arrogance. Each video a nail in the coffin of their false authority. Miss Evelyn, however, remained exactly as she had been from the start, calm, steady, dignified. She lifted her grocery bags from the ground, brushing dust off the loaf of bread with gentle hands. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence spoke louder than any outburst could. The taller officer finally tried to speak. His voice low, almost pleading. "Ma'am, perhaps we overreacted. Maybe we can forget all of this. You can go home and we'll move on." A mess. Evelyn turned slowly to face him. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, held his gaze until he shifted uncomfortably. "Forget?" she asked softly. "You want me to forget the way you disrespected me? The way you mocked me, searched my groceries, humiliated me in front of my neighbors?" She paused, her voice calm but firm. "No, officer, I will not forget, and neither will anyone here." The crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising in support. "That's right," someone shouted. "We saw everything." Another added, "It's all on video." The younger officer's hands fidgeted nervously. He looked toward the police car as though debating whether to simply get back inside and drive away. But the taller one knew better. "We can't leave," he muttered under his breath. "They told us to stand by. If we move, it'll only get worse." Minutes felt like hours. The tension hung heavy in the air, broken only by the murmurs of the crowd and the occasional crackle of the officer's radio. Every second stretched longer than the last, and then, in the distance, another car approached, a marked but official, its tinted windows glinting in the afternoon sun. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "Here they come," someone whispered. "This is it." The vehicle pulled up smoothly to the curb, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. His posture was sharp, his eyes locked immediately on the two officers. Without a word, he walked past them and approached Miss Evelyn. His voice softened instantly. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "are you all right?" Miss Evelyn gave a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied calmly. The man turned sharply to the officers, his demeanor changing like a switch. "You too," he said coldly. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" The younger officer opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The taller one stammered. We thought she was acting suspicious. Suspicious." The man cut him off. His voice was like thunder, controlled but dangerous. "She is the mother of the Attorney General of the United States, and you harassed her? In public? In front of witnesses?" The crowd erupted in gasps, though many had already guessed the truth. Still, hearing it confirmed sent waves of shock through everyone present. The officers looked at each other, pale and shaking. The arrogance that had carried them minutes before had dissolved into raw fear. They knew their careers, their reputations, everything were hanging by a thread. Miss Evelyn adjusted her scarf and looked around at the crowd, then back at the officers. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but unshakable. "You saw me as weak because of my age. You saw me as powerless because of my skin. But you failed to see the truth. Respect is not given because of power, it should be given because of humanity. You forgot that?" Okay, her words pierced deeper than any official reprimand could. The crowd applauded softly, not out of celebration, but out of respect. Phones captured the moment, ensuring her lesson would travel far beyond Maple and Fifth. The Shift in power was complete. The officers, once in control, now stood like children caught in the act, stripped of their arrogance. Miss Evelyn, once humiliated, now stood taller than ever, not because of her son's title, but because of her unshakable dignity. And everyone watching knew this was no longer just about two officers and one woman. It was about a message the whole world needed to hear. The silence that followed was suffocating. The crowd had gone still, their phones raised like witnesses holding their own kind of evidence. The man in the suit, sent as a representative, stood between Miss Evelyn and the officers, his sharp gaze slicing into them. The weight of his words still hung in the air. She is the mother of the Attorney General of the United States. The younger officer's mouth hung open. His face, once full of arrogance and laughter, now looked pale, and Niall looked pale. And lost. His fingers twitched nervously at his sides. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words would not come. Each time he tried to form a sentence, the memory of his mocking voice, "At your age, carrying groceries. You sure that's true?" rang in his ears. And now, with dozens of witnesses around him, he knew there was nothing he could say to erase it. The taller officer, normally the more composed of the two, was no better. His jaw clenched and unclenched, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He held Miss Evelyn's ID card in his hand, but suddenly it felt heavy, almost burning. With trembling fingers, he extended it back to her. "Here, ma'am," he said softly, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. We're sorry for the misunderstanding." Miss Evelyn did not reach for the card immediately. She let the silence stretch, her gaze steady on him. The taller officer's arm quivered slightly as he continued to hold it out. Desperate for her to take it, desperate to end the unbearable pause. Finally, she accepted it with slow, deliberate movements. She slipped it back into her purse without a word. The crowd's murmurs began to grow again. "Now they're apologizing," someone said loudly. But where was that respect before? Another voice cut through. They weren't sorry when they searched her groceries. Laughter, sharp and scornful, rose from the onlookers. This time, it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at them. The younger officer shifted his feet, glancing desperately at the patrol car as though wishing he could melt into the seat and disappear. His lips trembled as he muttered, "We didn't mean any harm," but the crowd didn't buy it. They responded with jeers, their frustration spilling into words. "You laughed at her." Someone shouted. "You threatened her?" Another added. "You thought she was nobody." A third voice accused. Each accusation landed like a blow. The officers shrank under the weight of public judgment. Their authority had turned to dust, their badges meaningless in the face of the truth. Miss Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried farther than the officers' broken apologies. "You see, gentlemen," she said calmly, "you thought you held power over me, but you never did. Power is not in a uniform or a badge. True power is in character, in respect, in how you treat those who seem powerless. And tonight, you have shown your character to everyone here." Her words hit harder than any official reprimand. The taller officer's eyes darted toward the man in the suit, silently pleading for rescue. But the representative only shook his head, his jaw tight. With controlled anger, "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs," he said coldly. "And that's the least of your worries." The younger officer's knees felt weak. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and whispered, "Please. We didn't know." Miss Evelyn's eyes softened for the first time, though she didn't let them off easily. "That's the point," she replied gently. "You didn't know. And yet you still chose to mock, to threaten, to harass. What if I had truly been powerless? What if I didn't have a son in high office? Would you have treated me the same way? Or worse? The crowd murmured again, nodding, agreeing. Her question wasn't just for the officers, was for everyone. The two men looked smaller than ever now, their pride shattered, their confidence gone. They were no longer the enforcers of the law, but examples of its failure. Sweat glistened on their brows, their breaths shaky and uneven. The arrogance that had once filled their voices was gone, replaced with shame that burned hotter with every passing second. The man in the suit leaned closer to them, his voice low but sharp enough for the crowd to hear. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? This isn't just about disrespect. This is about abuse of power, racial profiling, harassment of an elderly citizen, all of it recorded. He gestured toward the dozens of phones pointed directly at them. The younger officer's eyes widened as if he were only now realizing the true scale of the damage. Recorded, he whispered, his voice trembling. Yes, the man said firmly, and it won't be hidden. The Attorney General already knows. The public will know. Your careers may very well be over tonight. The taller officer's shoulders slumped as though the words had punched the air out of him. His lips parted, but he couldn't form an answer. He stared at the ground, ashamed to even lift his eyes. Miss Evelyn adjusted her scarf and looked at them one last time. This was never about who my son is, she said softly. It was about who I am and who you chose to see. You chose to see nothing, but now the whole world sees you. The crowd erupted in applause, not the joyous kind, but the kind filled with conviction, with relief that justice had begun to show itself. The sound echoed down the street, drowning out the officer's silence. The shift was complete. The officers stood in shock, stripped of their arrogance, stripped of their false power, and left with only the bitter taste of regret and Miss Evelyn. She stood taller than ever, not because of her son's title, but because of the dignity that no one, not even those who tried to humiliate her, could take away. The street was no longer just a street. Maple and Fifth had turned into a living stage for one of the most unforgettable lessons anyone there would ever witness. The crowd had grown larger, the buzz of voices carrying from one end to the block to the other. Dozens of phones stayed lifted, their cameras capturing every second, every expression, every word that passed between Miss Evelyn and the officers who had tried to break her dignity. But now, the balance of power had changed completely. The officers stood in silence, their heads slightly bowed, their arrogance evaporated. They no longer looked like men in control. Their uniforms and badges could not protect them from what was already set in motion. Every second of their harassment had been recorded, every sneer and every insult frozen in time for the world to see. Miss Evelyn, however, did not gloat. She did not raise her voice in triumph, nor did she demand vengeance. Instead, she stood tall in her quiet grace, holding her grocery bags as though they were the only proof she needed that she had simply been living her life. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, neighbors, strangers, children, parents, Saul. Watching her, some looked angry, some relieved, others deeply moved. She could feel their emotions, but she knew this moment wasn't only about her. It was about something greater. With a soft sigh, she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, yet it carried through the air like a steady drumbeat. Today, y'all saw what happens when people forget the meaning of respect, she said. You saw how quickly power can be abused when someone looks at another human being and only sees weakness. They looked at me and saw an old woman. They looked at my skin and thought it gave them the right to treat me as less. But let me remind you, all respect does not come from a badge or a title or money. Respect comes from seeing another person as human, no matter who they are. The crowd fell silent, her words sinking into their hearts. Even the children who had been restless earlier now stood quietly, listening. She continued, her tone steady, her eyes on the officers who still avoided her gaze. They thought they could harass me because they assumed I was powerless. They thought no one would stand up for me, that no one would care. But what they fail to understand is this: no one is truly powerless when the truth is on their side. And no one is invisible when people are watching. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped softly, and then another joined in, until the entire block seemed to be applauding her. The sound wasn't loud or chaotic, it was steady, almost reverent, like a salute. The man in the suit, standing nearby, spoke up firmly, his voice echoing. This incident will not be swept under the rug. The Attorney General himself is aware, and there will be consequences. He turned sharply to the officers. This is no longer in your hands. It's in the hands of justice. The officers didn't respond. They couldn't. Their silence was their only acknowledgement of the shame pressing down on them. Miss Evelyn, however, didn't linger on their humiliation. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the crowd. Remember this moment? She said gently. Remember what you saw today. Not for me, but for the next person. Stand up when you see injustice. Speak when someone is silenced. And never forget that even the smallest voice can carry the biggest truth. Her words settled over the people like a warm blanket on a cold day. Neighbors nodded to one another. Strangers shared glances of understanding. The children would go home and tell their parents. The videos would spread across the internet by nightfall, sparking conversations far beyond Maple and Fifth. The officers, once the symbols of control, are now the lesson-living reminders of what arrogance and prejudice lead to. Miss Evelyn, once the target of humiliation, was now the teacher, the example, the symbol of strength and dignity that no one could deny. As the unmarked car door opened, ready to escort her home safely, she bent down to adjust the bag of groceries. At her side, she did it slowly, with the same grace she had shown from the very beginning. A simple act, yet it reminded everyone watching that she hadn't asked for this confrontation. She had only wanted to carry her groceries home, before. Stepping into the car, she looked once more at the officers. Her voice was soft, almost tender, but it cut deeper than anger ever could. I hope you learn from this, because the next person you stop may not have a son in high office. The next person may truly be alone. Treat them with the respect you denied me today. The crowd clapped again, some cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. And with that, Miss Evelyn stepped into the car, her head held high, her dignity untouchable. The vehicle pulled away, leaving the officers surrounded by the same community they had tried to intimidate. But now, instead of fear in the air, there was something else: hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that people would remember her words. And as the videos began to upload online, spreading like wildfire, one truth became clear. This was no longer just Miss Evelyn's story. It was everyone's story. A story of justice, dignity, and the lesson that respect must never be optional.